You are a nurse at the Royal Earlswood Hospital in Surrey, England. It's a gray morning in 1941, and the autumn rain beats against the asylum windows with a persistence that matches the despair within these walls. You've been summoned to the children's ward for a special admission, though the matron's nervous whispers and the presence of men in expensive suits tell you this is no ordinary patient. The little girl they carry in is perhaps 4 or 5 years old, dressed in clothes far finer than anything you've seen on the other children here. Her face bears the distinctive features of Down syndrome, but there's something else. Something in the way she holds herself, in the delicate curve of her fingers, that speaks of a different world entirely. The men won't give her real name. They provide documents with blanks where names should be, speaking in hushed tones about discretion and national interest. But you catch glimpses of a family crest on her tiny suitcase before it's whisked away, and you recognize the worried woman who watches from the doorway, her face half hidden by an expensive veil. You've seen that profile before, in newspaper society pages, at royal garden parties. This is no ordinary abandonment. This is a burial of the living, a erasure of bloodlines, a secret that the most powerful family in Britain needs to hide. As you settle the confused child into a bed that will become her world for the next 4 decades, you realize you're not just a nurse anymore. You're a keeper of royal shame, a guardian of a secret so profound that an entire empire depends on its concealment. This little girl, who reaches for a mother already disappearing down the corridor, is about to vanish from history itself. Her name will be erased from family trees, her existence denied by those who share her blood, her life sacrificed on the altar of genetic purity and public image. Welcome to the hidden asylums of the 20th century, where royal blood meant nothing if it flowed through imperfect veins. Welcome to a world where disability was considered a stain so shameful that even the most privileged families would rather pretend their children had died than acknowledge their existence. Welcome to the story of the forgotten princesses whose only crime was being born different in a world that demanded perfection. Before diving into these forgotten stories of survival and suffering, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these ancient stories together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared curiosity about the past. The story of royal families hiding disabled children isn't unique to Britain, but it was here, in the heart of an empire that prided itself on civilized values, that the practice reached its most systematic and cruel extremes. To understand how princesses could vanish into asylums, how blue blood could be denied and disowned, we must first understand the toxic mixture of eugenics, social prejudice, and royal image management that made such betrayals not just possible, but inevitable. In 1941, when 2 young cousins of the Queen Mother were secretly placed in the Royal Earlswood Hospital, the world was at war. But for the British royal family, there was another battle being fought, one against the perceived threat of genetic imperfection within their own bloodline. Nerissa and Catherine Bowes-Lyon, aged 22 and 15 respectively, were the daughters of John Herbert Bowes-Lyon, brother of the Queen Mother. Born with severe learning disabilities, they represented everything the royal family feared most. Visible proof that their bloodline was not immune to the genetic variations that could produce disabled children. The decision to hide them wasn't made in haste. It was calculated, deliberate, and executed with the cold efficiency of a military operation. The girls were removed from their family home, Glamis Castle in Scotland, and transported to Surrey under cover of wartime confusion. Their names were erased from Burke's peerage, the official record of British nobility, with the false notation that they had died. For all official purposes, Nerissa and Catherine Bowes-Lyon ceased to exist in 1941. But in the bleak wards of Royal Earlswood, they lived on, abandoned and forgotten, for decades to come. The Royal Earlswood Hospital, despite its regal name, was no palace. Built in 1855 as the Asylum for Idiots, it represented Victorian attitudes toward mental disability at their most brutal. By the 1940s, it had evolved into a sprawling complex where society's unwanted were warehoused rather than treated. The philosophy was containment, not care. The goal was invisibility, not integration. For the 1,000 souls confined within its walls, Royal Earlswood was less a hospital than a prison, where the only crime was being born different. Into this world of institutional neglect, Nerissa and Catherine arrived with nothing but the clothes on their backs and the terrible weight of their family's shame. The staff, sworn to secrecy, knew them only by false names. Their royal heritage, which should have guaranteed them the finest care available, instead ensured their complete abandonment. No family visited. No letters arrived. No acknowledgement of birthdays or holidays broke the monotony of their institutional existence. They had been erased so thoroughly that even their survival became a form of death. The daily routine at Royal Earlswood was a grinding repetition of basic maintenance. Patients were woken at dawn, dressed in identical institutional clothing, and herded through a schedule designed more for staff convenience than patient welfare. Meals were served in vast dining halls where hundreds ate in enforced silence. Education, therapy, or any form of mental stimulation was virtually non-existent. The prevailing medical opinion held that mental defectives were incapable of improvement, so why waste resources trying? For Nerissa and Catherine, who had spent their early years in the relative luxury of aristocratic homes, the shock must have been profound. They had known silk dresses and nursery maids, private tutors, and family gatherings. Now they wore rough cotton shifts and answered to numbers rather than names. The cousins, at least, had each other, clinging together in a world that had suddenly become hostile and incomprehensible. But even this comfort was limited by the institutional practice of separating patients by age and perceived ability level. The cruelest aspect of their abandonment was its totality. Other patients might receive occasional visits from guilty relatives or concerned friends. But for the Bowes-Lyon sisters, there was nothing. The family that had made the decision to hide them maintained the fiction of their deaths with remarkable consistency. When questioned about family members, the Queen Mother would simply omit her nieces from any discussion. It was as if they had never existed, as if their births had been some terrible mistake that could be corrected through denial. But the sisters were far from alone in their aristocratic abandonment. Throughout the institutions of Britain, other noble families were making similar choices. The Darwin family, descendants of the great naturalist who had ironically written extensively about human variation, quietly institutionalized members who didn't meet social expectations. The Tennant family, Scottish nobility with connections to prime ministers and poets, had their own hidden relatives in various asylums. Each family maintained its public facade of genetic superiority while secretly warehousing the evidence to the contrary. The medical establishment of the time was complicit in this systematic abandonment. Doctors who should have advocated for their patients instead collaborated in their erasure. Medical records were falsified, death certificates issued for living patients, and a culture of silence enforced through professional pressure and social expectation. The very physicians who took oaths to do no harm became active participants in a system that destroyed lives through neglect and denial. Dr. Margaret Thompson, one of the few medical professionals who later spoke out about conditions at Royal Earlswood, described scenes that belonged more to Dickensian fiction than 20th century medicine. Patients sat in rows, rocking endlessly, with nothing to occupy their minds or hands. The more able helped care for the less able, creating a hierarchy of misery where everyone suffered, but some suffered more. The smell of urine and disinfectant was overwhelming. The sounds, crying, moaning, occasional screaming, never stopped. It was a warehouse of human despair, made worse by the knowledge that many of these people could have lived meaningful lives with proper support. The psychological impact on patients like Nerissa and Catherine was devastating. Imagine knowing you had a family, remembering a life before the asylum, but being unable to understand why you had been abandoned. Imagine looking for familiar faces that never came, waiting for visits that were never planned, hoping for rescue from a family that had declared you dead. The confusion and hurt must have been unbearable, made worse by the inability to fully articulate or process these complex emotions. Both sisters had sufficient cognitive ability to understand their abandonment on some level. Staff reports, discovered decades later, described Catherine's distress when she saw newspaper photographs of the royal family, pointing excitedly and trying to communicate some connection that the staff didn't understand or chose to ignore. Nerissa would reportedly become agitated during radio broadcasts of royal events, as if some deep memory was stirring, some recognition of voices she had once known. The particular cruelty reserved for disabled women in these institutions added another layer to their suffering. Female patients were seen as especially problematic because of the possibility of pregnancy. The eugenics movement, still influential despite the ongoing war against Nazi Germany, viewed disabled women as potential breeders of more defectives. Sterilization, either through surgery or through deliberate neglect of reproductive health, was common. The sisters' sexuality was seen as something dangerous to be suppressed rather than a natural part of their humanity to be acknowledged and supported. The 1950s brought no improvement to their situation. As Britain celebrated the coronation of Elizabeth II, Nerissa and Catherine's cousin, the sisters remained in their institutional prison. The new Elizabethan age, with all its promise of modernization and progress, meant nothing within the walls of Royal Earlswood. If anything, their situation became more entrenched. The young queen, advised by courtiers who understood the potential scandal, maintained the family line that her cousins were dead. The lie had been repeated so often it had taken on the weight of truth. Meanwhile, the science that the royal family feared would expose their genetic vulnerabilities was actually beginning to understand conditions like Down syndrome. In 1959, Jérôme Lejeune discovered that Down syndrome was caused by an extra chromosome, not by moral failings or bad blood. This scientific breakthrough should have reduced stigma and improved treatment. Instead, it often intensified families' desire to hide affected relatives, as the genetic nature of the condition seemed to confirm fears about hereditary taint. For families like the Bowes-Lyons, this new understanding brought not compassion, but deeper shame. If Down syndrome and other developmental disabilities were genetic, then their presence in the family suggested fundamental flaws in bloodlines that claimed superiority. The very idea that royal chromosomes could misalign like anyone else's was unthinkable in a system built on the premise of inherent superiority. Better to continue the lie than admit to such ordinary human vulnerability. The 1960s, that decade of social revolution and changing values, largely passed the sisters by. While the outside world experienced the Beatles, moon landings, and civil rights movements, Nerissa and Catherine lived in an unchanged routine of institutional monotony. They aged within the walls that had confined them since childhood, their lives measured not in achievements or relationships, but in the simple passage of empty days. Staff came and went, but the sisters remained, permanent fixtures in a landscape of neglect. It was during this period that a young nurse named Onell Braithwaite began working at Royal Earlswood. Unlike many of her colleagues who had become hardened to the institutional culture, Onell was disturbed by what she saw. She later recalled her shock at discovering the true identities of patients she had been told were nobody special. Through careful observation and discreet inquiries, she pieced together the hidden connections between certain patients and some of Britain's most prominent families. There was definitely a two-tier system, Braithwaite remembered. Most patients received basic care at best, but there were some who got even less attention, as if there was an unspoken agreement to keep them invisible. Nerissa and Catherine were among these. They had each other, which was more than many patients had, but they had been so thoroughly abandoned by their family that staff barely acknowledged their existence. It was as if their neglect was policy. The sisters developed their own ways of coping with their abandonment. They created a small world within their shared room, decorating with pictures torn from magazines, particularly images of the royal family. Whether they fully understood their connection to these distant figures or simply found comfort in the familiar faces is impossible to know. But staff reported that Catherine would kiss photographs of the Queen Mother, her aunt who had consigned her to this living death. Language, that fundamental tool of human connection, largely abandoned them in their isolation. With no family to talk to and staff who saw little point in conversation with defectives, both sisters' verbal abilities deteriorated over the years. They communicated mainly through gestures, touches, and the wordless understanding that develops between people who share profound trauma. Their silence was not inherent to their conditions, but imposed by an environment that saw no value in their voices. The food at Royal Earlswood reflected the institutional mindset that patients were problems to be managed rather than people to be nourished. Meals were bland, repetitive, and served with mechanical efficiency. Special diets for medical conditions were virtually unknown. Birthday cakes, holiday meals, or any acknowledgement of individual preferences were foreign concepts. The sisters ate what they were given, when they were given it, in a dining hall designed to process maximum numbers with minimum staff interaction. Personal possessions were discouraged in the institutional setting. Patients might have a few items of clothing, perhaps a toy or book if they were fortunate, but the accumulation of objects that mark a normal life was impossible. For Nerissa and Catherine, who had presumably once owned the beautiful things that aristocratic children take for granted, this poverty of possessions must have been particularly stark. They owned nothing, had nothing, were treated as nothing. Medical care at Royal Earlswood focused on containment rather than treatment. Behavioral issues were managed with sedatives rather than understanding. Physical health problems were often ignored until they became acute. Dental care was virtually non-existent, leading to painful conditions that affected eating and general health. The sisters, like all patients, aged prematurely under this regime of neglect, their bodies bearing the accumulated damage of decades of inadequate care. The staff, who cared for them day after day, occupied a complex moral position. Many were kind individuals who did their best within a brutal system. They might sneak extra food to favored patients, spend a few minutes in conversation, or provide small comforts against regulations. But they were also participants in a system of oppression, enforcing rules designed to dehumanize and following orders that perpetuated neglect. The good ones burned out quickly. The harsh ones thrived. The majority simply became numb to the suffering around them. In 1961, a glimmer of hope appeared in the form of new mental health legislation that promised to transform institutional care. The Mental Health Act theoretically shifted focus from custody to treatment, from warehousing to rehabilitation. Community care was promoted as an alternative to institutional placement. For a brief moment, it seemed the age of the asylum might be ending. But for patients like Nerissa and Catherine, already middle-aged and thoroughly institutionalized, these reforms came too late. The implementation of reforms was slow and uneven. Royal Earlswood, like many institutions, paid lip service to new approaches while maintaining old practices. Community placement required families willing to accept their disabled relatives back into their lives. For the sisters who had been declared dead, no such option existed. They remained in the only home they had known for decades, watching as younger, less disabled patients left for foster homes or group living situations. The death of their uncle, the 14th Earl of Strathmore and Kinghorn, in 1972 might have been an opportunity for family reconciliation. Inheritance and succession often prompt families to acknowledge all their members. But the Bowes-Lyon family maintained their silence. The new Earl either didn't know about his cousins or chose to continue the family policy of denial. The sisters remained unacknowledged. Their existence an inconvenient truth in a family narrative of noble bloodlines and royal connections. As the 1970s progressed, the disability rights movement began to challenge the warehousing of disabled people. Activists, many of them disabled themselves, demanded recognition as full human beings deserving of education, employment, and community inclusion. The language began to shift from mental defectives to people with learning disabilities. But these changes in the wider world penetrated the walls of Royal Earlswood slowly, if at all. For patients who had spent decades being told they were worthless, new philosophies of empowerment were difficult to grasp. The sisters' routine continued unchanged. Wake, dress, eat, sit, sleep, repeat. Holidays passed unnoticed except for slightly different institutional meals. Their birthdays went uncelebrated. Years blended into decades with nothing to distinguish one from another. They had been so thoroughly erased that even their continued existence seemed like an oversight, a clerical error in the family's careful management of its image. It wasn't until 1987 that the first cracks appeared in the wall of silence surrounding the Bowes-Lyon sisters. Fenella Moncraft, their niece, inadvertently revealed their existence to researchers investigating the family tree. The subsequent scandal, when the press discovered that two members of the Queen Mother's family, listed as dead in Burke's peerage, were actually alive in a mental institution, sent shockwaves through the establishment. But even then, the family's response was denial and deflection rather than acknowledgement and apology. The Queen Mother, when confronted with the revelation, maintained that she had been told her nieces were dead. Whether this was true or convenient fiction to maintain plausible deniability remains unclear. What is certain is that neither she nor any other family member rushed to Royal Earlswood to embrace their long-lost relatives. The sisters remained where they had always been, their existence now public but their abandonment unchanged. Nerissa died in 1986, a year before the scandal broke. She had spent 45 years in the institution, her entire adult life wasted in unnecessary confinement. Her death was as ignored as her life had been. No family attended her funeral. She was buried in a pauper's grave marked only with a plastic tag bearing a serial number. The aunt, who lived in luxury as the Queen Mother, couldn't spare the money for a proper headstone for the niece she had abandoned. Catherine lived on, now truly alone for the first time in her life. The loss of her sister, her only constant companion through decades of abandonment, must have been devastating. Staff reported that she searched for Nerissa, not understanding where her sister had gone, unable to comprehend that this final abandonment was permanent. Her distress was managed with medication rather than compassion, her grief dismissed as behavioral problems rather than recognized as the profound loss it was. The public revelation of the sisters' existence prompted no royal visit, no family reunion, no attempt at restitution for decades of neglect. The palace's response was primarily concerned with damage control, emphasizing that this was a matter for the Bowes-Lyon family rather than the royal family proper. The distinction was legalistic rather than moral, a way of maintaining distance from a scandal that threatened to tarnish the carefully maintained royal image. Catherine continued to live at Royal Earlswood, later transferred to Ketwin House as the old asylum was closed. She became something of a cause célèbre among disability rights activists who saw in her story the perfect illustration of how society's most privileged could abandon its most vulnerable. But for Catherine herself, this attention meant little. She had lived too long in isolation to understand or benefit from her newfound fame. She remained what the system had made her, institutionalized, isolated, and invisible despite the spotlight. The nurses who cared for Catherine in her final years described a woman who had been hollowed out by decades of neglect. She rarely spoke, communicated mainly through gestures, and seemed to live more in her own world than in reality. Whether this withdrawal was inherent to her condition or created by a lifetime of abandonment is impossible to determine. What is certain is that she lived a life far more limited than her disability required, constrained not by her own capabilities but by her family's shame. Catherine's interests, such as they were after a lifetime of institutional deprivation, centered on music and movement. She would sway to songs on the radio, particularly enjoying hymns and classical pieces. She liked to look through magazines, especially those featuring royalty, though whether she recognized the faces as family or simply enjoyed the colorful images, no one could say. These simple pleasures were all that remained of a life that might have been rich with experiences had she been born into a family that valued her existence. The staff, who knew her best, spoke of a gentle nature that had survived decades of neglect. She rarely showed anger or frustration, having learned perhaps that such emotions brought no relief. Instead, she seemed to accept her limited world with a resignation that spoke volumes about the completeness of her institutionalization. She had been taught so thoroughly that she deserved nothing that she expected nothing, a lesson no child should ever learn. The death of the Queen Mother in 2002 might have been another opportunity for reconciliation. Surely, with the family matriarch gone, someone might have felt free to acknowledge Catherine's existence, to visit the cousin who had been hidden for so long. But the silence continued. The royal family, now headed by Catherine's cousin Elizabeth II, maintained the policy of non-acknowledgement. Catherine remained alone, her royal blood meaningless in a world that valued appearances over truth. In her final years, Catherine's world shrank even further. Age and institutionalization had taken their toll. She spent most of her time in her room, venturing out only for meals and mandatory activities. The staff who cared for her were kind but busy, able to provide only basic care to a woman who had been systematically deprived of love for over 6 decades. She was clean, fed, and safe, but she was not cherished, valued, or even truly seen. Catherine Bowes-Lyon died on February 23, 2014, at the age of 87. She had spent 73 years in institutions, hidden away, because her existence challenged her family's image of genetic perfection. Her death, like her life, went largely unnoticed by the family that had abandoned her. No royal attended her funeral. No statement was issued acknowledging her passing. She was buried with slightly more dignity than her sister, but still without family present to mourn her. The story of Nerissa and Catherine Bowes-Lyon is not unique in the annals of aristocratic shame. Throughout the 20th century, wealthy and powerful families across Europe systematically hid their disabled children in institutions, creating a hidden population of abandoned nobility. Each family had its own methods of erasure, its own justifications for cruelty, but the pattern was consistent. Children who didn't meet standards of perfection were disappeared. In Sweden, the Bernadotte royal family quietly institutionalized Prince Eric, who had epilepsy and learning disabilities. In Austria, Habsburg descendants with genetic conditions resulting from centuries of inbreeding were hidden in alpine sanatoriums. In Russia, before the Revolution, the Romanovs maintained special estates where unfortunate relatives could be kept out of public view. After the Revolution, the Soviet system simply continued the practice under different ideological justifications. The Dutch royal family had their own secrets, with whispered stories of children born with disabilities who vanished into institutional care. Belgian nobility maintained discreet arrangements with private clinics. Even in republics like France, aristocratic families found ways to hide children who might damage their social standing. The practice was so widespread it constituted an informal system, with certain institutions known for their discretion in handling delicate family matters. These hidden children lived parallel lives to their celebrated relatives. While their siblings attended glittering social events, they sat in day rooms staring at walls. While their cousins married into other royal houses, they were denied even the possibility of friendship. While their families accumulated wealth and honor, they owned nothing and were honored by no one. They were the shadow population of European nobility, numerous but invisible. The medical professionals who facilitated these abandonments operated in a moral gray zone. Many genuinely believed they were providing a service, removing the burden of disabled children from families ill-equipped to handle them. The prevailing medical opinion held that institutionalization was the kindest option for all involved. But this medical consensus was shaped more by social prejudice than scientific understanding, more by eugenic ideology than therapeutic knowledge. Dr. Ernst Keller, who worked in Swiss institutions housing hidden nobility, later reflected on his complicity. We told ourselves we were providing specialized care, but we were really providing specialized forgetting. These children didn't need to be hidden away. They needed education, therapy, love, all the things we denied them in the name of protecting their families' reputations. We were not healers. We were concealers, hiding the evidence of human variation that every family produces. The economic structures supporting this system were complex and lucrative. Private institutions charging premium rates for discreet care proliferated across Europe. They offered not just medical services but guaranteed anonymity, promising families that their shameful secrets would never be revealed. Some institutions specialized in particular types of disabilities, becoming known as the place to send a child with Down syndrome or cerebral palsy when family honor was at stake. The staff at these institutions occupied various positions on the moral spectrum. Some were sadists who enjoyed power over the helpless. Others were idealists who quickly became disillusioned. Most were ordinary people who needed jobs and learned not to ask questions about why certain children never received visits or mail. The culture of these institutions encouraged emotional detachment, viewing patients as problems to be managed rather than people to be cared for. The architecture of abandonment was carefully designed. Institutions were often located in remote areas, far from public transportation and prying eyes. They were surrounded by high walls and locked gates, ostensibly for patient safety, but really for family security. Inside, the design prioritized efficiency and control over comfort or stimulation. Long corridors, locked wards, and observation windows created environments more penal than therapeutic. The daily routines in these institutions were soul-crushing in their monotony. Patients were woken at fixed times, fed identical meals on rigid schedules, and cycled through activities designed more to pass time than provide enrichment. Education was minimal or non-existent. Therapy was often limited to sedation for behavioral control. Recreation might consist of sitting in a day room with a television playing programs no one watched. It was existence without life, survival without purpose. The psychological impact of institutional life on hidden royal children was profound and lasting. Many developed what staff called institutional behaviors, rocking, self-harm, withdrawal, that were then used to justify their continued confinement. The lack of stimulation, affection, and normal human interaction created disabilities beyond whatever genetic conditions they might have been born with. The institutions that claimed to care for them instead manufactured additional reasons for their isolation. Language development was particularly affected by institutional neglect. Children who might have developed complex communication skills in supportive environments instead learned that their voices didn't matter. Many stopped speaking entirely, not from inability, but from the learned futility of trying to communicate with people who didn't listen. Their silence was then interpreted as proof of profound disability rather than recognized as a rational response to chronic neglect. The rare occasions when institutionalized royals encountered reminders of their families were particularly cruel. A radio broadcast of a royal wedding, a newspaper photograph of a coronation, a television special about their relatives' lives, these glimpses of the world they had been expelled from must have been agonizing. Some patients would become agitated during these times, their distress dismissed as random behavioral problems rather than understood as grief for the lives they had been denied. Sexual abuse was endemic in many institutions, with disabled residents seen as safe targets for predation. Young women like Nerissa and Catherine were particularly vulnerable, unable to report abuse effectively and unlikely to be believed if they did. The sterilization programs common in many institutions were partly motivated by the desire to eliminate evidence of staff rape. Royal blood provided no protection. If anything, it might have made victims more attractive to abusers who enjoyed the power of violating nobility. The complicity of religious organizations in this systematic abandonment adds another layer of moral failure. Many institutions were run by religious orders who preached charity while practicing cruelty. Nuns and monks who had taken vows of service instead became wardens of neglect. Chapel services where patients were herded to pray to a God who seemed to have abandoned them as thoroughly as their families had. The spiritual abuse compounded the physical and emotional neglect. The few attempts at reform that occurred during the mid-20th century were often superficial. Institutions might repaint walls, update terminology, or introduce token therapeutic programs while maintaining the fundamental structure of warehousing human beings. Royal patrons might visit similar institutions for photo opportunities, demonstrating their charitable concern for the disabled while their own relatives languished unvisited in nearby facilities. The irony of royal involvement in disability charities while maintaining family members in institutions was stark but unexamined. The Queen Mother served as patron of numerous organizations serving people with learning disabilities, while her nieces lived in neglect. Royal family members would make speeches about the value and dignity of all human life, while their cousins were denied basic dignity. This cognitive dissonance was maintained through careful compartmentalization and willful ignorance. The role of Burke's peerage and similar genealogical authorities in perpetuating family lies deserves particular scrutiny. These supposedly authoritative records willingly published false information about deaths, births, and family connections to maintain noble fictions. Their complicity in erasing disabled family members from official history made the abandonments seem more complete and irreversible. Once declared dead in the official record, resurrection became almost impossible. The financial aspects of hiding royal relatives were significant, but carefully obscured. Institutions were paid substantial sums to maintain their special patients, money that came from family trusts and estates, but was never publicly acknowledged. The Bowes-Lyon family paid for Nerissa and Catherine's care while denying their existence, a hypocrisy that extended to many noble families. They would pay to keep their relatives alive, but hidden rather than dead, but acknowledged. The lost potential of these hidden lives is incalculable. How many of these abandoned children might have lived fulfilling lives with proper support? How many had talents and capabilities that were never developed? How many might have contributed to their societies if given the chance? We will never know because they were denied even the opportunity to try. Their disabilities were treated as defining their entire existence rather than as one aspect of complex human beings. The comparison with how royal families handled physical disabilities versus developmental disabilities is instructive. Royal children with physical impairments, blindness, deafness, mobility issues, were often accommodated and included in family life. But those with intellectual or developmental disabilities were erased. This distinction reveals deep prejudices about which forms of human variation were acceptable, and which were so shameful they required complete denial. The gradual revelation of these family secrets in the late 20th century came not from family conscience but from external pressure. Journalists, researchers, and disability rights activists forced acknowledgement of what families would have preferred to keep hidden forever. Even then, the response was typically minimal. brief statements of regret rather than meaningful acknowledgement or restitution. The families seemed more upset about being exposed than about what they had done. The impact on staff who worked in institutions housing hidden royalty was complex and lasting. Many developed what we would now recognize as secondary trauma from witnessing chronic neglect and abuse. Some became whistleblowers, risking their careers to expose conditions. Others internalized the institutional values, convincing themselves that they were providing necessary care rather than participating in systematic abandonment. Retirement often brought delayed reckoning with the moral compromises they had made. The transformation of Royal Earlswood and similar institutions in the late 20th century came too late for most of their long-term residents. As philosophies changed and community care became the preferred model, institutions began closing or radically restructuring. But for people like Catherine, who had spent decades in institutional settings, these changes were often more disruptive than liberating. They had been so thoroughly shaped by institutional life that they struggled to adapt to new approaches emphasizing choice and autonomy. The modern legacy of these historical abandonments continues to influence how we think about disability and family. The fear of genetic taint that motivated royal families to hide their disabled children persists in different forms. Prenatal testing and selective abortion of fetuses with Down syndrome and other conditions reflects similar anxieties about perfection and normalcy. We may have stopped hiding disabled children in institutions, but we haven't stopped trying to prevent their existence. The language we use to discuss these historical cases often reflects continued discomfort with disability. Media coverage tends to focus on the scandal of abandonment rather than the humanity of the abandoned. The hidden royals are presented as tragic victims rather than complex individuals. Their disabilities are emphasized while their personalities, preferences, and potential remain unexplored. Even in death, they are defined by what was done to them rather than who they were. The question of justice for these abandoned individuals remains unresolved. No family has offered meaningful restitution for decades of neglect. No government has fully acknowledged its role in facilitating these abandonments. No institution has adequately accounted for its participation in systematic abuse. The victims are mostly dead, unable to demand justice for themselves. Their stories are told by others, filtered through interpretations that may or may not reflect their own understanding of their experiences. The photographs that survive of people like Nerissa and Catherine are haunting in their ordinariness. They show women who look remarkably like their royal relatives, sharing family features that should have guaranteed them inclusion rather than exile. Their faces reflect not the profound disabilities that supposedly justified their abandonment, but the common humanity that their families refused to acknowledge. They look like people who deserved better than they received. Today, tourists visit the stately homes and palaces where these abandoned children should have lived. They admire family portraits that exclude hidden members, walk through nurseries where certain children were never allowed to play, and hear sanitized histories that omit inconvenient truths. The absence of acknowledgement perpetuates the erasure, allowing families to maintain fictional narratives of unbroken noble lineages. The sites of former institutions like Royal Earlswood have been redeveloped, their histories literally paved over. Luxury apartments and shopping centers stand where thousands lived and died in unnecessary isolation. Small plaques might acknowledge the site's former use, but they rarely convey the full horror of what occurred within those walls. The physical erasure of institutional spaces parallels the historical erasure of their residents. The survivors of institutional abandonment, those few who lived to see changing attitudes toward disability, often struggled to tell their own stories. Decades of being told they were worthless, of having their voices ignored, left many unable to articulate their experiences. Others chose silence, finding the memories too painful to revisit. Their testimonies, when they exist, are fragments of larger truths, glimpses into systematic abuse that operated for generations. The professionals who eventually exposed these systematic abandonments faced significant resistance. Families used legal threats, social pressure, and financial influence to suppress investigations. Institutions invoked patient privacy to avoid scrutiny. Governments preferred to avoid scandals that might reflect poorly on prominent citizens. The truth emerged slowly, incompletely, and often only after the worst perpetrators were beyond accountability. The connections between royal abandonment of disabled children and broader eugenic practices deserve careful consideration. The same ideologies that justified hiding aristocratic children with disabilities also supported forced sterilization, euthanasia programs, and immigration restrictions. Royal families were not outliers in their treatment of disability, but exemplars of widely held prejudices given extreme expression through their resources and power. The modern disability rights movement emerged partly in response to these historical injustices. Activists who demanded "nothing about us without us" were reacting to generations of decisions made about disabled people without their input or consent. The independent living movement, inclusive education, and supported employment all represent attempts to create alternatives to the institutional abandonment that families like the Bowes-Lyons perpetuated. Current royal approaches to disability reveal both progress and continued discomfort. Modern royals are more likely to acknowledge disabled family members and support disability causes. But the pressure for genetic perfection remains intense, visible in the careful management of royal pregnancies and the celebration of normal births. The shadow of past abandonments influences present attitudes, even when explicitly rejected. The story of royal children hidden in institutions challenges comfortable narratives about progress and civilization. These abandonments occurred not in ancient history, but within living memory, perpetrated not by ignorant peasants but by educated elites, facilitated not by primitive beliefs but by modern medical and social systems. They reveal how easily societies can rationalize cruelty when it serves the interests of the powerful. As we remember Nerissa and Catherine Bowes-Lyon and the countless other hidden royals whose names we'll never know, we must ask uncomfortable questions about our own complicity in systems of abandonment. Who are we hiding today? Whose existence do we deny to maintain comfortable fictions? What future generations will judge us for accepting as normal? The royal babies they hid may be gone, but the attitudes that enabled their abandonment persist in new forms. The ultimate tragedy of these hidden lives is not just the suffering they endured, but the love they were denied. Every child deserves to be cherished, not for meeting standards of perfection, but for their inherent humanity. The royal families who hid their disabled children violated this fundamental truth, choosing reputation over relationship, image over integrity. Their abandoned relatives paid the price for this choice in decades of unnecessary isolation and neglect. In the end, the forgotten princesses and princes remind us that royal blood means nothing if it's not accompanied by human decency. They were born into families with every advantage: wealth, power, influence, except the one that mattered most: the willingness to love children who didn't match expectations. Their lives, limited and lonely as they were, stand as testimony to the profound consequences of conditional love and the terrible price of family shame. The stones of former institutions may be scattered, the records destroyed or hidden, the victims buried in unmarked graves. But the truth of what happened to royal children deemed imperfect cannot be entirely erased. In remembering them, Nerissa and Catherine Bowes-Lyon and all the others whose names we'll never know, we honor not their royal connections but their human dignity, so long denied and so belatedly acknowledged. They deserved better than they received. The least we can do is ensure they are not forgotten again. You stand in the nursery of Windsor Castle in 1919, watching as a young mother cradles her newborn daughter. The silk curtains flutter in the morning breeze, and sunlight streams across the Persian rug, but something is terribly wrong. The midwife's face has gone pale. The royal physician whispers urgently to the nurse, and the baby, little Nerissa, doesn't cry like other infants. Her eyes, when they finally open, have that distinctive almond shape that makes the doctor step back and clutch his medical bag with trembling hands. The mother, a member of the Bowes-Lyon family and cousin to the future Queen Mother, feels her heart constrict as the physician approaches with that careful, practiced expression medical men wear when delivering devastating news. "Your Grace," he begins, his voice barely above a whisper, "the child presents with irregularities." You watch as the word spreads through the castle like poison through veins. Servants avert their eyes. The father paces the corridor outside, his footsteps echoing on marble floors that have witnessed centuries of royal births, but never one quite like this. Because in 1919, in the heart of the British Empire's most powerful family, a child has been born with what will later be known as Down syndrome. And in this world of crowns and bloodlines, of divine right and genetic superiority, such a child represents something far worse than a medical condition. She represents the unthinkable, imperfection in the royal line. The nursemaid who first held Nerissa trembles as she wraps the infant in the finest Belgian lace, the same lace that has swaddled princes and princesses for generations. But this child will never wear the christening gown displayed in the royal collection. She will never have her portrait painted by the court artist, never have her birth announced in the Times with the fanfare reserved for royal arrivals. Instead, hushed conferences begin immediately. Lawyers are summoned. Doctors confer in Latin, using words the parents aren't meant to understand. The machinery of royal damage control grinds into motion before the baby has even been properly fed. 7 years later, you're there again when Catherine arrives, bearing the same telltale features as her sister. The scene repeats itself with horrible familiarity. The same shocked silence, the same whispered conferences, the same gradual realization that lightning has struck twice in the same family. 2 daughters, both carrying that extra chromosome that marks them as different, as other, as something the royal family cannot, will not acknowledge. The nursery, that should echo with laughter and visits from doting relatives instead, becomes a place of hushed conversations and locked doors. These are children who will never be presented at court, never have their portraits painted in royal regalia, never even have their existence properly acknowledged by the family whose blood runs through their veins. Before diving into these forgotten stories of survival and suffering, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these ancient stories together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared curiosity about the past. The terrible truth is that Nerissa and Catherine Bowes-Lyon were not anomalies. They were part of a pattern that stretched back centuries, a dark tradition of royal families systematically erasing children who didn't meet their standards of perfection. To understand the full horror of what happened to these girls and countless others like them, we must first understand what Down syndrome meant in an era before genetic science, before compassion conquered superstition, before society recognized that different did not mean less than. Down syndrome occurs when a person is born with an extra copy of chromosome 21. This additional genetic material alters development, creating distinctive physical features: the almond-shaped eyes, the single palmar crease, the lower muscle tone, and varying degrees of intellectual disability. Today, we understand this as a natural genetic variation that occurs in approximately 1 in every 700 births. But in centuries past, these differences were viewed through a lens of fear, shame, and profound misunderstanding. Medieval physicians called such children monsters or changelings, believing they were either cursed by God or switched at birth by malevolent spirits. The word cretin, now recognized as a cruel slur, was once medical terminology, derived from the French chrétien, meaning Christian, a reminder that these children were human and deserved compassion, though the term itself became twisted into an insult. Royal families, whose entire claim to power rested on the notion of divine appointment and superior bloodlines, saw these children as living refutations of their right to rule. How could a king claim to rule by God's grace when God had apparently cursed his lineage? How could a bloodline be superior when it produced what society deemed inferior? The medieval chroniclers who documented royal births in exhaustive detail would suddenly become vague when a child was born marked or touched by God's mysterious ways. These euphemisms concealed a harsh reality. In the 12th century, a French nobleman's records mention a son who departed this earthly realm to dwell with the angels immediately after birth. But no burial site is listed, no funeral mass recorded. Another chronicle from the 14th century England notes that a duke's child was called back to heaven before drawing earthly breath. Yet, servants' diaries from the same period mention strange cries from the castle's tower for years afterward. Return with me now to that Windsor nursery, where young Nerissa lies in her crib, unaware that her fate has already been decided. The royal physician, Dr. Martin Whitmore, has seen this before. He knows the signs, the upward slanting eyes, the small ears, the way the baby's tongue protrudes slightly. He's delivered hundreds of royal and noble babies in his career, but ones like this, they require special handling. In his medical bag, alongside the tools of birth and healing, he carries blank death certificates, just in case. The family conference that follows is a masterpiece of British understatement and horror. They gather in the blue drawing room, with its portraits of illustrious ancestors gazing down. Ancestors whose genetic superiority must not be questioned. The baby's grandmother sits rigid in her chair, her face a mask of controlled emotion. "What are our options?" she asks, though everyone knows the options are few and all of them cruel. "There are institutions," Dr. Whitmore offers carefully. "Discreet places where the child can receive specialized care." He doesn't mention that most children in such places receive little care at all, that they're warehoused like broken furniture, hidden from a world that doesn't want to see them. He doesn't need to. Everyone understands. The baby's mother, let's call her Lady Elizabeth, clutches a handkerchief embroidered with the family crest. She wants to protest, to say that Nerissa is her daughter regardless, but she knows the price of defiance. Her own sister defied family wishes once, married beneath her station, and hasn't been received in society since. But that scandal pales compared to this. A mésalliance can be forgotten in a generation. A defective child threatens the very mythology on which aristocracy depends. By 1941, when Nerissa is 22 and Catherine is 15, the solution presents itself in the form of the Royal Earlswood Hospital in Surrey. Originally built as the Royal Earlswood Asylum for Idiots, the cruel terminology of the era preserved in stone. It's a sprawling Victorian institution where society's unwanted are sent to be forgotten. The building itself tells a story of good intentions corrupted by convenience. Founded in 1847 by philanthropists who genuinely wanted to help those with intellectual disabilities, it has become by the 1940s a dumping ground for embarrassments, a place where families can deposit their shameful secrets and pretend they never existed. Picture the scene. Two young women, confused and frightened, led through heavy wooden doors that close behind them with finality. Nerissa, now 22, has lived her entire life in seclusion, but at least it was a seclusion softened by familiar surroundings, by servants who'd known her since birth, by the distant but real possibility that her family might visit. Catherine, at 15, is just beginning to understand that the world has no place for people like her and her sister. They've known only the privileged world of their birth. Soft beds, good food, gentle voices. Now they enter a world of long corridors that smell of carbolic acid and despair, of crowded wards where dozens of patients rock back and forth in rhythmic misery, of nurses who see them not as cousins to royalty, but as two more numbers in an endless ledger of the abandoned. The intake process strips away their identities with ruthless efficiency. Their fine clothes are taken, replaced with coarse institutional uniforms. Their names are entered in a ledger, not as Bowes Lyon, certainly not with any hint of their royal connections, but simply as Nerissa and Catherine, patient numbers 12,438 and 12,439. The most shocking betrayal comes not in their institutionalization, cruel as that was, but in what happens next. In Burke's Peerage, the definitive record of British nobility, an entry is made. Both sisters are listed as deceased, dead, erased not just from public view but from existence itself. The lie is breathtaking in its audacity. These are not distant relatives whose fate might be genuinely unknown. These are first cousins of the woman who will become the Queen Mother, relatives of the current king. Their death is recorded with the same official certainty as actual deaths, complete with dates and circumstances. While they live and breathe in Earlswood, while they wake each morning to the sounds of other forgotten souls, while they eat institutional food and wear institutional clothes and slowly forget the faces of the family that abandoned them, the official record shows them as corpses. The psychological violence of this erasure is almost incomprehensible. To be alive but declared dead, to exist but be denied existence, to breathe but be unacknowledged, it's a form of murder that leaves the body intact while destroying the person. This lie will persist for decades. Nerissa will live in Earlswood until her death in 1986, over 40 years of institutional life, of Christmases without family, of birthdays unmarked by anyone who shares her blood. Catherine will survive even longer, not dying until 2014, having spent nearly 70 years in that place, 7 decades of being officially dead while actually alive, the ultimate erasure. But to truly understand the horror of what happened to these sisters, we must look beyond Britain's shores, beyond the 20th century, to see how royal families throughout history have dealt with the problem of imperfect children. The pattern is as consistent as it is heartbreaking. Children born with visible disabilities or intellectual differences were hidden, institutionalized, or worse. Travel back with me to medieval France, to the court of Philip IV in 1298. The Queen has given birth, but the child, a boy who should have been celebrated as a potential heir, bears the unmistakable signs of what we now know as Down syndrome. The court physicians huddle together, speaking in hushed tones about marks of divine disfavor and corruption of the royal seed. Within hours, the official announcement is made. The Queen was delivered of a stillborn son. Prayers are requested for the soul of the departed prince. But in the castle's highest tower, accessible only by a single winding staircase, a wet nurse is installed with strict instructions. She is to care for a child who doesn't exist, to feed and clean a royal prince who has already been declared dead. For 3 years, she performs this duty, until one winter morning she arrives to find the room empty, the crude wooden crib cold. No explanation is given, no questions are permitted. The stillborn prince has simply ceased to be a problem. Similar stories echo through the centuries. In the 15th century Spain, Ferdinand and Isabella, the monarchs who funded Columbus and united their country, had a daughter whose birth is recorded, but whose life is not. Palace inventories from the period list expenses for special accommodations in a remote monastery, including child-sized furniture and toys suitable for a girl of noble birth. The monks who ran the monastery left records of a holy innocent who lived with them for 16 years, a girl who bore striking resemblance to the royal family but whose name was never spoken. The Renaissance, that great flowering of art and culture, brought no enlightenment for royal children born with disabilities. If anything, the period's obsession with physical perfection and classical ideals made their situation worse. The Medici of Florence, patrons of Michelangelo and Botticelli, had their own secret, a son born to Cosimo II in 1615, who was immediately declared to have died of plague. Yet, household accounts show payments to a country villa outside Florence for the maintenance of a special guest for the next 30 years, including wages for nurses, special diets, and educational materials designed for slow learners. Travel with me to Prussia in 1915, where another royal child enters the world bearing the unmistakable features of Down syndrome. Princess Alexandrine of Prussia, daughter of Crown Prince Wilhelm, is born into a family that prides itself on military prowess and Teutonic perfection. The Hohenzollerns, rulers of the German Empire, are not known for their tolerance of weakness. The very ideal of Prussian nobility is bound up with concepts of strength, discipline, and genetic superiority that leave no room for a child like Alexandrine. Yet, something remarkable happens. Alexandrine is not immediately institutionalized. Perhaps it's because by 1915 the world is already falling apart. World War I rages across Europe, and the certainties that once governed royal behavior are crumbling along with empires. Perhaps it's because her parents, for all their Prussian severity, cannot bring themselves to abandon their daughter entirely. Or perhaps it's simply that even the hardest hearts can sometimes be softened by a child's smile. Instead, she remains with her family, a decision that seems almost revolutionary by the standards of the time. She appears in family photographs, her distinctive features clearly visible among her more typical siblings. In one photo from 1920, she sits on her mother's lap, wearing a white dress with elaborate embroidery, her almond-shaped eyes looking directly at the camera with an expression of curious intelligence. She even features on commemorative postcards. Imagine that, a royal family allowing the public to see their imperfect child. But don't mistake this for acceptance. Alexandrine may live at home, but she exists in a carefully controlled bubble. She will never attend state functions, never be considered for any royal duties, never be allowed to represent the family in any official capacity. When foreign dignitaries visit, she is kept in her quarters. When the family attends the opera or military parades, Alexandrine remains behind with her specially selected companions, not quite servants, not quite friends, but something in between. Her parents hire special tutors who come to the palace, ensuring she never has to venture into the public eye for her education. These tutors, sworn to secrecy, report that Alexandrine is an eager student within her limitations. She learns to read and write, though slowly. She develops a passion for music and can play simple pieces on the piano. She loves to draw, filling sketchbook after sketchbook with charming, if childlike, pictures of the world she sees from her window. When the family attends public events, Alexandrine remains behind, watching from windows as her siblings depart in carriages for the life she can never share. One tutor's diary, discovered decades later, describes finding her at the window during a state procession, tears rolling down her cheeks as she watched her brothers in their military uniforms riding past. "Why can't I go?" she asked. The tutor had no answer that wouldn't break both their hearts. She is loved, perhaps, but loved in the shadows, a secret that happens to live in the same house rather than being locked away elsewhere. Her siblings are instructed to be kind to her, but also to understand that she is different, that she cannot be included in their public lives. This creates its own form of cruelty, the constant reminder that love has limits, that acceptance has conditions, that even within her own family she is apart. The careful management of Alexandrine's existence reveals something profound about royal attitudes toward disability. It wasn't necessarily that these children were unloved, though many undoubtedly were, but that love itself was subordinate to image. The monarchy's survival depended on projecting strength, divine favor, and genetic superiority. A child with Down syndrome, no matter how beloved in private, could never be allowed to threaten that image. Consider the impossible position of Alexandrine's mother, Crown Princess Cecilia. By all accounts, she genuinely loved her daughter. Servants reported that she spent hours with Alexandrine, teaching her handicrafts, reading to her, simply sitting with her in companionable silence. But this same loving mother had to make daily decisions that reinforced her daughter's isolation. When planning family photographs for public release, Alexandrine had to be excluded. When writing Christmas letters to relatives, her daughter's existence had to be minimized or omitted entirely. When foreign royalty visited, this mother had to pretend she had one less child than she actually did. Every milestone Alexandrine achieved, learning to read, to write her name, to play simple songs on the piano, was celebrated in private while the public remained ignorant of her existence. Her 20th birthday passed without the fanfare that would normally accompany a Prussian princess reaching adulthood. Instead, there was a small family dinner, a cake eaten in the privacy of her quarters, presents that were thoughtful, but could never include the things she might have wanted most: inclusion, recognition, the chance to be seen as she was rather than hidden for what she represented. It was a love that dared not speak its name, constrained by the iron requirements of royal protocol. The servants who cared for Alexandrine developed their own attachments to this gentle, affectionate young woman. Many stayed in their positions far longer than typical, unwilling to abandon someone who had already been abandoned by so much of the world. They became her surrogate family, the people who saw her daily, who knew her moods and preferences, who celebrated her small victories, and comforted her during her frequent illnesses. But even Alexandrine's relatively privileged life pales in comparison to what earlier centuries offered, or, rather, didn't offer, to royal children born with disabilities. The historical record becomes murky as we travel back in time, filled with suspicious gaps and telling silences. Royal births were extensively documented, Yet sometimes children simply vanish from the record. A prince is born. Chroniclers note the date and time, and then nothing. No death recorded, no life documented, just absence where a person should be. Medieval monasteries sometimes contain cryptic references to special charges or God's particular children, sent by noble families with substantial donations. Were these the hidden sons and daughters of royalty, secreted away where their differences wouldn't threaten dynastic ambitions? The monks who cared for them left few records. Whether from discretion or direct orders, we cannot know. But the pattern is suggestive. A royal birth, a generous donation to a remote religious institution, and then silence. In the monastery of San Salvador de Laer in northern Spain, archaeologists have found a walled-off section that was opened in the 1960s. Inside were the remains of what appeared to be a luxurious apartment within the austere monastery. Silk wall hangings rotted with age, furniture too fine for monks, toys that seemed designed for a noble child. The monks' records from the 15th century mention only the special care of God's innocent lamb, whose name is known only to heaven. Local legends spoke of mysterious crying from the monastery at night, of a child who was never seen but whose presence was felt. Who was this hidden child? What royal family paid for their segregation from the world? Some historians believe the reality was even darker. In an age when infant mortality was high and medical knowledge limited, it would have been tragically easy to ensure that a child with visible disabilities simply didn't survive their first days. A pillow held too long, milk withheld, exposure to cold, murder disguised as natural death, with no questions asked because no one wanted to ask them. These are the crimes that leave no evidence except absence, the children who were never allowed to become people. The French court offers us another glimpse into this world of hidden children and family shame, though, in this case, the family was not quite royal, but close enough to feel the same pressures. In 1928, Charles de Gaulle, future president of France and titan of 20th century history, welcomed his third daughter into the world. Anne de Gaulle was born with Down syndrome, entering a family that moved in the highest circles of French society and would soon be at the center of world events. What makes Anne's story remarkable is not that she was hidden, though she largely was, but that within the confines of her seclusion, she was genuinely loved. De Gaulle, the stern general who would stare down Hitler and reshape France, was tender and devoted with his youngest daughter. His aide-de-camp would later write that he had never seen the general, famous for his icy demeanor, display such warmth as when he was with Anne. De Gaulle would spend hours with her, reading stories, playing simple games, creating a world within their home where she was treasured. He called her "my joy," and by all accounts she was. When he came home from his military duties, Anne would run to greet him with an enthusiasm that melted his typically stern expression. He would sweep her into his arms, this man who stood on ceremony with presidents and kings, and dance around the room with her while she laughed with delight. Yet even this love operated within strict boundaries. Anne did not appear at state functions. When de Gaulle rose to power, she remained hidden from the public eye. The French people knew their leader had two daughters, the ones who could fulfill the role of a statesman's children. Anne existed in a parallel universe, loved but invisible, cherished but unacknowledged. The family's photo albums tell the story. Dozens of pictures of Anne at home, playing in the garden, celebrating birthdays with her family. But in the official portraits, the ones released to newspapers and hung in government buildings, she is absent. The tragedy deepened as Anne's health declined. Children with Down syndrome often face additional medical challenges, and in Anne's case, respiratory problems plagued her from birth. The de Gaulle consulted the best doctors in France, seeking treatments that might strengthen her lungs, but 1940s medicine had little to offer. They installed special ventilation in her room, hired round-the-clock nurses, tried experimental treatments that offered hope but delivered disappointment. In 1948, at the age of 20, she developed pneumonia. Today, this would likely be treatable. Then, for a young woman with Down syndrome whose immune system was already compromised, it was a death sentence. De Gaulle maintained a vigil at her bedside, this man who had led armies and negotiated with Churchill and Roosevelt, reduced to helpless watching as his beloved daughter struggled for breath. Anne's last words, according to family accounts, were, "Papa." De Gaulle, who had faced the Nazi war machine without flinching, broke down completely. His wife Yvonne found him cradling Anne's body, weeping and repeating, "My little one, my poor little one." It was the only time in their marriage she had seen him cry. De Gaulle's grief was profound and genuine. This man who had led the Free French through World War II, who had stared down political crises without flinching, was broken by the loss of his daughter. At her funeral, attended only by family and close friends, he stood at the graveside long after others had departed. A solitary figure in his military uniform, mourning not just his daughter but perhaps also the world that had forced her to live in shadows. Yet, even in death, Anne remained partially hidden. Her funeral was private, her grave modest. The public mourning that would accompany the death of any other child of France's leader was muted, constrained by the same social pressures that had kept her hidden in life. French newspapers mentioned her death only briefly, referring to her as the youngest daughter of General de Gaulle who had been in poor health. No mention of Down syndrome, no acknowledgement of the life she had lived or the joy she had brought to her family. It was only after her death that Anne's impact truly began to be felt. Her mother, Yvonne de Gaulle, channeled her grief into action, founding the foundation Anne de Gaulle, dedicated to supporting children with disabilities. It was as if Anne's death finally gave her family permission to acknowledge publicly what they had always known privately, that she mattered, that children like her deserved support and recognition, that hiding them away was not protection but a form of slow violence. But for every Anne de Gaulle, partially hidden but genuinely loved, how many others were there who found neither love nor even basic human dignity? The institutions of Europe and America were filled with children whose only crime was being born different in families that couldn't tolerate difference. The Royal Earlswood Hospital, where the Bowes-Lyon sisters spent their lives, was considered one of the better institutions. Yet, even there, conditions were often appalling. Return now to Earlswood in 1941, where Nerissa and Catherine are beginning their new lives as non-people. The admissions process is deliberately dehumanizing. Their fine clothes are taken, silk dresses and cashmere sweaters that will be burned rather than donated, lest someone recognize their quality and ask questions. They are stripped, examined, their bodies catalogued for defects with the same clinical detachment used for livestock. They are issued institutional clothing, rough gray dresses that will be their uniform for decades, marked with numbers rather than names. Imagine the daily reality for Nerissa and Catherine. They wake not to the gentle ministrations of nursemaids, but to the harsh efficiency of overworked institutional staff. The dormitory is a vast room filled with iron beds, each exactly 18 inches from the next. Privacy is non-existent. The sounds of 40 women sleeping, crying, moaning, talking to themselves create a constant cacophony that makes real rest impossible. At 5:30 a.m., the lights flip on with industrial brightness. Those who don't rise immediately are pulled from their beds. Breakfast is porridge, gray and lukewarm, eaten with hundreds of others in a dining hall that echoes with the sounds of distress. Some patients rock back and forth, others moan wordlessly. Many simply stare at nothing. The sisters who once ate off fine china with silver spoons now use battered metal implements and plates that have served thousands of forgotten souls before them. The porridge is often lumpy, sometimes sour, always insufficient. Hunger becomes a constant companion. The days stretch endlessly. There are no tutors here, no attempts at education. The prevailing wisdom of the era says that idiots and imbeciles, the cruel clinical terminology of the time, cannot learn, so why try? Instead, there is occupational therapy of the most basic kind. Sorting buttons, rolling bandages, simple repetitive tasks designed more to pass time than develop skills. The sisters who might have learned to read, to write, to express themselves, are instead taught only to be quiet and compliant. The workshop where they spend their days is a warehouse of wasted potential. Women who might have been artists weave the same basket patterns day after day. Women who might have been musicians are allowed no instruments. Women who might have been mothers are sterilized without their consent. The institution's way of ensuring that defectives don't breed. Nerissa and Catherine sit at a long table, their fingers working automatically to sort buttons by size. White, black, brown, over and over, hour after hour, year after year. Recreation time is spent in a walled courtyard where patients walk in circles or sit on benches staring at the walls. There are no books, no games, no activities that might stimulate the mind or bring joy. The sisters stay close together, a unit of two in a sea of isolation. They develop their own communication, gestures and expressions that only they understand. A private language born of shared abandonment. Visits from family are non-existent. This is not unusual. Many families, having placed their defective relatives in institutions, prefer to forget they exist. But for Nerissa and Catherine, the abandonment is particularly acute because their family continues to appear in newspapers, on television, in the public eye. In the day room, where patients are sometimes allowed to watch television, they might catch glimpses of their cousins at royal events, might recognize faces they once knew, now aged and important. Do they understand who these people are? Do they remember their connection? The staff doesn't know and doesn't ask. It's easier to assume the patients understand nothing. Christmas at Earlswood is perhaps the cruelest time. The institution makes token efforts. A tree in the dining hall, paper decorations made by patients. A special meal that is only marginally better than usual. Local church groups sometimes visit to sing carols, their voices bright with forced cheer, as they perform for an audience that responds with silence, tears, or occasional screaming. The visitors leave quickly, duty done, returning to their normal lives where children are treasured and families gather in warmth. For Nerissa and Catherine, Christmas means watching other patients receive visits, small gifts, proof that someone, somewhere, remembers they exist. The sisters have each other, but no one else. They sit together during the carol service, perhaps remembering Christmases from their childhood, trees decorated with golden ornaments, presents wrapped in silk ribbons, family gatherings where they were, if not fully included, at least present. Now they are ghosts at their own feast, forgotten by everyone who shares their blood. The medical care at Earlswood is basic at best, negligent at worst. Patients with Down syndrome often have heart conditions, thyroid problems, and other health issues that require monitoring and treatment. But the institutional doctors, overwhelmed by the sheer number of patients and limited by the prejudices of their time, provide only the most basic care. Infections spread rapidly through the overcrowded wards. Dental problems go untreated until teeth simply fall out. Mental health issues, depression, anxiety, trauma from institutionalization itself, are ignored entirely or treated with sedatives that leave patients zombified. The sisters age prematurely in this environment. Photographs from their admission show two young women with the round faces and almond eyes characteristic of Down syndrome, but also with a vitality, a spark that suggests intelligence and personality. By the 1960s, that spark has dimmed. They move more slowly, their faces marked by the resignation of those who have learned that tomorrow will be exactly like today, and today is not worth living. The cruelest twist comes in how they are remembered, or rather, not remembered. When Nerissa dies in 1986, she is buried in a pauper's grave, marked only with a plastic tag bearing a serial number. This woman, cousin to the Queen of England, descendant of Scottish nobility, is laid to rest with less dignity than a stranger would receive. The institution notifies no family. After all, according to official records, she's been dead since 1963. Her body is disposed of with the same efficiency used for all unclaimed patients, a final erasure of a life that was never allowed to be lived. It's only when journalists discovered the deception in 1987 that a proper headstone is hastily erected, not out of genuine feeling, but to minimize scandal. The stone bears only her name and dates. No mention of her connection to royalty. No acknowledgement of the decades of abandonment. Even in death, the family maintains its distance, issuing statements through spokespersons about difficult decisions made in different times, and the best interests of all concerned. The discovery of the sisters' existence and their false deaths sends shockwaves through British society. How could this happen? How could the royal family, that symbol of stability and tradition, have perpetrated such a deception? The palace's response is telling in its carefully crafted neutrality. These were not members of the immediate royal family, they note, as if distance of relationship somehow justifies decades of abandonment and lies. But the public reaction reveals something important. Times have changed. What was once acceptable, even expected, the hiding away of imperfect children, now strikes people as monstrous. The very institutions that once housed society's unwanted are being exposed for the hellholes they often were. Documentaries begin appearing, showing the conditions inside places like Earlswood, the overcrowding, the neglect, the waste of human potential. The disability rights movement is gaining strength. Parents of children with Down syndrome are demanding education, inclusion, and recognition for their children. They form support groups, lobby for legislation, challenge the medical establishment that still recommends institutionalization. Catherine, still alive in 1987 when the scandal breaks, becomes an unwitting symbol of changing attitudes. Journalists attempt to visit her, to give her the attention she was denied for so long, but the institution refuses access. She is too fragile, they say, too set in her routines to handle disruption. The truth is likely more complex. After decades of institutionalization, Catherine has become what the system made her, dependent, isolated, unable to cope with a world she was never allowed to know. She continues to live at Earlswood, then at Keightwin House when Earlswood closes, still officially dead according to Burke's peerage, still unvisited by family. Staff members who care for her report that she is gentle, quiet, attached to routine. She likes music, they say, becoming animated when songs from the 1940s play on the radio. Perhaps they remind her of something, some glimpse of the life she might have had. She dies in 2014 at the age of 86, having spent 72 years in institutions. her entire adult life erased from official existence. The world that created Nerissa and Catherine's tragedy is dying, though not quickly enough. Across Europe and America, the great institutions are closing. Their residents moved to smaller facilities or group homes. The medical understanding of Down syndrome has advanced dramatically. Early intervention programs help children with Down syndrome reach potentials that would have seemed impossible in 1941. People with Down syndrome are increasingly visible in media, in workplaces, in communities. Yet, even as we condemn the actions of past generations, we must ask uncomfortable questions about our own. How many children with disabilities are still hidden away? If not in institutions, then in back bedrooms, kept from school, from community, from life? In some countries, prenatal testing for Down syndrome leads to termination rates above 90%. Are we more accepting, or have we simply found more efficient ways to ensure that people with Down syndrome are never born? How many families still feel shame rather than pride in their children who are different? How many societies still value perfection over diversity, normality over the beautiful variety of human existence? The royal families of history held up a mirror to their society's values, and what we see reflected is not flattering. When the powerful could so easily discard their own children for the crime of being different, what hope did ordinary families have of doing better? When even love wasn't enough to overcome the fear of social judgment, what does that say about the societies that created such fear? The institutions that housed people with disabilities were not anomalies. They were logical extensions of societies that saw human worth as conditional, that valued conformity over compassion, that preferred hiding problems to solving them. Every grand asylum built to warehouse the defective was a monument to collective failure, an admission that we didn't know how to, or didn't want to, include everyone in the human family. But history is not just a catalog of cruelties, it's also a record of progress, however slow and incomplete. Today, people with Down syndrome are increasingly visible, valued, and included. They attend mainstream schools, hold jobs, get married, advocate for themselves and others. They act in television shows, compete in Special Olympics, start businesses, and contribute to their communities in countless ways. They are no longer hidden but celebrated, no longer erased but embraced. This transformation didn't happen overnight, and it didn't happen without struggle. Every child with Down syndrome who attends a regular school represents a battle fought by parents who refuse to accept institutional wisdom. Every adult with Down syndrome who holds a job represents employers who chose inclusion over exclusion. Every person with Down syndrome who lives independently represents a society slowly learning that different doesn't mean less capable, just differently capable. Consider how different Nerissa and Catherine's lives might have been if they had been born today. Instead of Earlswood's gray walls, they might have attended school with support services tailored to their needs. Early intervention programs would have helped them develop communication skills. Physical therapy would have strengthened their muscles. Occupational therapy would have taught them life skills. They might have learned to read using methods designed for visual learners, to write using assistive technology, to express themselves through art or music or dance. Instead of make-work occupational therapy, they might have pursued genuine interests and developed real skills. Many people with Down syndrome work in offices, restaurants, retail stores, and other businesses. Some run their own companies. They contribute to their communities not as objects of pity, but as valued members. Nerissa might have worked in a library, organizing books with the same attention to detail she once applied to sorting buttons. Catherine might have worked in a nursery, caring for plants with the gentleness that institutional life never let her express. Instead of isolation from their family, they might have been included in gatherings, their accomplishments celebrated rather than their existence denied. Modern royal families include members with various disabilities. Prince John of the United Kingdom, who had epilepsy, was hidden away in the early 20th century, but today's royals are more open about health challenges and developmental differences. The shame that once surrounded disability is slowly, too slowly, giving way to acceptance and even pride. Instead of dying forgotten, they might have lived remembered, valued, loved. They might have had friends beyond each other, relationships that enriched their lives, connections to communities that saw them as whole people rather than problems to be solved. They might have traveled, experienced different cultures, contributed their unique perspectives to a world that desperately needs diverse voices. The tragedy is not that they had Down syndrome. The tragedy is that they lived in a world that saw their Down syndrome as incompatible with human dignity. The tragedy is that their family's fear of judgment outweighed their capacity for love. The tragedy is that two women who might have lived full, meaningful lives instead spent decades in institutional limbo, officially dead while actually alive, erased from history while still drawing breath. Their story forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about how societies treat those they deem imperfect. It's easy to judge the royal families of the past for their cruelty, but harder to acknowledge that they were products of their time, acting according to social norms that valued conformity over diversity, perfection over humanity. Every era believes itself more enlightened than those that came before. Yet every era has its own blindness, its own cruelties disguised as common sense. Today, we medicalize what we once moralized. Instead of seeing disability as divine punishment, we see it as medical tragedy. Instead of hiding people with disabilities in institutions, we sometimes hide them through selective abortion or segregated education. Instead of declaring them officially dead, we sometimes act as if their lives are not worth living. The language has changed, become more clinical and less obviously cruel, but have the underlying attitudes transformed as much as we'd like to believe? These questions become more urgent as genetic testing becomes more sophisticated. We can now detect Down syndrome and many other conditions before birth. This knowledge brings power, but power without wisdom can lead to new forms of eugenics, more subtle but no less devastating than the old. When we can choose which lives come into existence, we must ask ourselves, what are we choosing and why? Are we preventing suffering, or are we preventing diversity? Are we exercising compassion, or are we succumbing to the same fears that led royal families to hide their imperfect children? The answer is not simple. Parents facing these decisions deserve support, not judgment. But as a society, we must ensure that our choices are based on accurate information about what life with Down syndrome can be, not on outdated stereotypes or fears. We must create a world where choosing to have a child with Down syndrome is not seen as tragedy, but as choosing a different kind of journey, challenging but also rewarding. The royal children hidden away for their disabilities represent more than individual tragedies. They represent systemic failures of compassion, systematic denials of humanity. They represent what happens when image matters more than truth, when conformity matters more than diversity, when fear matters more than love. They represent choices made not just by individuals, but by entire societies that created the conditions where such choices seemed reasonable, even necessary. But they also represent resilience. Despite everything done to erase them, we know their names. Despite decades of official death, their stories survive. Despite society's best efforts to forget them, we remember. Nerissa and Catherine Bowes-Lyon, Princess Alexandrine of Prussia, Anne de Gaulle. These names now stand as testimony to survival against overwhelming odds, to humanity that persists even when systematically denied. As we remember these forgotten children, we must ask ourselves what hidden children exist in our own time. Who are we failing to see? Who are we erasing from our collective story? Who are we condemning to lives of shadow and silence because their existence makes us uncomfortable? The answers to these questions are not comfortable, but they are necessary, because every child deserves to be seen, valued, and loved, not in spite of their differences, but because of them. Every person deserves to have their story told, their life acknowledged, their death mourned. Every family deserves support in raising children who don't fit society's narrow definitions of normal. And every society deserves to benefit from the contributions of all its members, not just those who meet arbitrary standards of perfection. The palaces where these children were born still stand, monuments to power and privilege. Tourists walk through their gilded halls, admiring the portraits of kings and queens, princes and princesses who shaped history. But the real monuments to these forgotten lives are not in stone and gold, but in the slow transformation of attitudes, the gradual recognition of human dignity, the ongoing struggle for inclusion and acceptance. Every time a child with Down syndrome is welcomed into a classroom instead of hidden away, these forgotten royal children are honored. Every time a person with disabilities is seen as fully human rather than as a problem to be solved, their memory is vindicated. The crown jewels glitter in their cases, symbols of royal power and continuity. But the real treasures of these royal lines were the children they threw away, the lives they deemed unworthy, the people they chose to forget. In remembering them now, in speaking their names and telling their stories, we restore a small measure of the dignity they were denied. We cannot undo the past, but we can ensure its lessons shape a better future, one where every child, regardless of ability, is seen as the treasure they truly are. The last of the hidden royal children we know about, Catherine Bowes-Lyon, died in 2014. She had spent nearly 70 years in an institution, forgotten by the family that should have cherished her, erased from the records that should have acknowledged her, hidden from the world that should have known her. Her death marked the end of an era, not because such practices have entirely ended, but because the silence that once surrounded them has been broken. The shame has shifted from those who were hidden to those who did the hiding. The tragedy is no longer in being born different, but in a world that couldn't accept difference. Today, when a royal baby is born, the world watches through social media and 24-hour news coverage. Every detail is scrutinized, every milestone celebrated. It would be almost impossible now for a royal family to hide a child with disabilities the way they once did. But visibility is not the same as acceptance, and acknowledgement is not the same as inclusion. The work of ensuring that every child is valued continues, in royal nurseries and ordinary homes, in parliaments and playgrounds, wherever children are born and lives are shaped. As we close this dark chapter of royal history, let us remember not just the cruelty, but the lives that persisted despite it. Somewhere in Earlswood's drafty halls, two sisters held hands and comforted each other through decades of abandonment. Somewhere in Prussia, a princess played piano pieces she would never perform publicly, but which brought her private joy. Somewhere in France, a general held his daughter and saw not her disability but her soul. These moments of humanity amid inhumanity remind us that love can persist even in the darkest places, that dignity can survive even systematic attempts to destroy it, that the human spirit is resilient even when society fails it utterly. The royal children hidden for their disabilities were denied much, but they were not denied their fundamental humanity, no matter how hard their families and societies tried to erase it. Their stories, finally told, stand as testimony to all the hidden lives that history has swallowed. They remind us to look for the gaps in our records, the silences in our stories, the people our societies prefer to forget. They challenge us to create a world where no child needs to be hidden, where no life needs to be erased, where everyone can step into the light and be seen, valued, and loved for exactly who they are. In the end, these forgotten princes and princesses teach us that royal blood means nothing if it cannot embrace all its children, that palaces are prisons when they shut out those deemed imperfect, that crowns are hollow when they rest on heads that turn away from family members who need love most. The true nobility is not in bloodlines kept pure, but in hearts open wide enough to love without conditions, in societies brave enough to include everyone, in the recognition that every life, however different, however challenging, has inherent worth that no amount of shame or fear can diminish. The stories of Nerissa and Catherine Bowes-Lyon, of Princess Alexandrine, of Anne de Gaulle, and of countless others whose names we will never know, are finally being told. Not as footnotes to royal history, but as central chapters in the human story. Not as shameful secrets, but as calls to conscience. Not as ancient history, but as urgent reminders that the work of inclusion, acceptance, and love is never finished. Their lives, hidden for so long, now shine as beacons, guiding us toward a world where every child is treasured, every person is valued, and every life is lived in the light.